Hello, my name is Connor,
And I'm Jason.
and you are listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast.
So for the next couple podcasts, we're going to be covering the Beatitudes. We've never done those before or looked at those through this lens. It's fascinating how people start big discussions. There's not a bigger sermon, if you will, than this one in terms of content and the way it impacts us. And so it's interesting, this start. It's a very fascinating dynamic. And so just a reminder, I've studied these, for a reminder to me, I guess, more than anybody, I've studied the Beatitudes many, many times to try to unpack them. And I'm asking questions about why is he setting it up this way? And now we're going to look at a totally different lens. And so I'm really intrigued with where that brings us. We're going to study the first 6 verses today. And he begins in verse 1 of chapter 5 of Matthew. Now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled." So, Connor, what amazes you as you read through this?
Yeah, so there's so much content-wise that is breathtakingly beautiful and challenging and hard in this. But I guess for me, the thing that really strikes me in this moment is the fact that this is, the meatiest, talk that Jesus, we have evidence that Jesus ever gave. And it seems like it's probably this culmination of all his teaching, these teachings that he's done, and the way that Jesus decides to open up his really difficult teachings, his really just incredibly hard teachings they're these teachings that are so positive and so uplifting, and they're so beautiful, especially to the audience of the people that he would have been preaching to. So there's a lot happening here. I kind of subscribe to there's a spiritual thing of what Jesus is talking about, but then there's also the very real reality that he's speaking to people that are meek, who are poor, who are all these things. And so I just imagine people, when they've heard about God and when they've heard about what it is to be a person of their God, so much of their life, it would have been from a place of condemnation, of you're a failure, and you need to figure it out and get right so that we can all be together. And just the fact that Jesus comes in and says, the attitude that you have been told your entire life or what it is to be in line with God, the attitude of having it all figured out, having it all together, that the first thing that Jesus wants to combat when he gives this is saying, hey, that attitude, that posture that you have been, that's been represented to you, that's been taught to you, that is not the posture of the kingdom of God. And that there's so many breathtaking things and so many moments where they were probably scandalous for the people hearing this, but that for me, it's just so cool.
I just really am with you on the amazed piece of this, in the sense that it's he starts off with actually tremendous chastisement, and he's advocating for everything that I think the Pharisees stood against, and therefore everything the religious culture stood against, because basically they are going to teach you need to be rich in spirit. You need to be happy, unless you're fasting, then you can pretend like, you're worse off, because Jesus deals with that. You need to be meek, which means you need to control your power. People don't need to see your power. They need to see your control more. And the Pharisees were all about power. And of course, Rome was all about power. And the oppressed Jew who didn't want to be oppressed would be all about power. And then he ends with, and when you're hungry and thirsty for better things. See, we think of righteousness as just this kind of abstract holiness, but for right things, for God's goodness to prevail, this is good. And that word blessed, I know from other studies, Makarios, I think it is in the Greek, but it's that idea of this perfect, like utopian, like you just feel amazing. You know what I mean? It's like having all your needs met. So he's like, you will have all your needs met when you own the fact you have nothing, and when you're really sad, and when people don't recognize you have power, and when you're constantly hungering and thirsting. And I'm like, what a beatdown.
Well, so that's a really fascinating perspective. So I guess for the person that is aspiring to the opposite of these things, aspiring to the thing the Pharisees have told them to, it would be a beatdown. But if somebody's already recognizing in the moment, man, yeah, no, I'm not even like necessarily like, oh, I'm such a wretched sinner, but just like, yeah, I'm kind of at the low of the totem pole. That would be fascinating, because I imagine for people in that crowd, there was probably both. There are probably people who were at just at the lowest of the low, and this is like, oh my gosh, like this is
breathing air.
This
finally.
is incredible.
Yeah.
You know, I my entire life I felt suffocated, and there are people who are in the exact same sort of life circumstances who are like, but all that I'm doing, all the work I've been putting in my life is to get away from what you're trying to tell me I should be going after.
That's so good. And see, this is the thing when trying to normalize this to my world, because I can't. I mean, I'm so limited because I can't be in the Jewish first century Jews' mind at this point. But I do think that humanity is probably consistent. You have a contingency on one end of the continuum. It's like, wait a minute, that's insulting. That's everything we don't want to be. And there's another end of that's like, oh, that's who I am. Wait a minute. I thought that was
He's talking
awful.
to me. This is
Yeah, and because we know they equated wealth and power with closeness to God, with proximity to God, this is a huge. It's like he's turning it over on top. So it does make me wonder, you know, if you go to the end of Matthew 7, it's like they're all amazed and he taught with authority. But is that a ouch? Like this because this is kind of general still. But when he gets to the fact that it says, hey, anybody happy you haven't murdered anybody? I was like, me. And he's like, but if you called your brother a name, you might as well have. You're like, whoa, that's twisty, you know?
Sure.
And he's about to get really stringent. Like, I think we hear hey, don't be like the Pharisees when they pray. And we're like, just pray better. But this is how they assessed who are the spiritual people. And I mean, think about it in church. If you've always held this doctrine, whatever this doctrine is, because somebody that you trusted told you, then you study the Bible on your own and you realize, wait a minute, that's not really biblical. And it might be actually counter what Jesus really espouses. That puts a lot of people in a faith crisis, you know, because they're like, wait a minute, I thought to please God I had to do this. And really, the truth is in Christ, you can always have this fresh start, i.e., the prodigal son or Paul or anybody, you know, that you would look at. But the feelings you have of instability and shock, and maybe that idea, I can hear somebody teach with authority and not feel warm and fuzzy. And maybe that's a big amazement to me right now, is putting this all together.
Well, I wonder. So you have somebody that you loved and you trusted, or that you accepted as having authority, and then you maybe discover after studying your own, like, hey, maybe they had this wrong, and that feels like, oh my, you know, it feels like earth shattering in a bad way. But if you grew up in a situation where you heard all these things in church, you heard all these like oppressive, all these hard things that you just like, I don't like, this is so, like, I guess they're on stage, they're the ones, you know, they're the ones everyone's
must know.
They must know, but I really don't like the way this is. It doesn't jive with but I've been told I just have to accept it, so it is what it is. But then you study it and you discover those things that were heavy-handed, that were oppressive, and that it turns out were abusive, are not of God. Then, man, Jesus becomes so much more clear, and he becomes so much more beautiful. Whereas before, all these false ideas that you had, so it's that same continuum that we're all going to find ourselves on. That for some people, when they find out what they were taught when they were younger, it's not true. It can take them away from the faith. But when some people find out what they were taught or how they were taught when they're younger is not true, it brings them running back to God.
That's so good. So what I am thinking all the time, I just know, I hope that our first podcast I would listen to and say, man, that was really good, but here's something I've learned that I didn't have it right. You know what I mean? Because I hope to always be growing. I hope to always be learning. A true disciple is one that's always learning. And that's the beauty of, if you've been taught your confidence is in your doctrinal stances, you know, of whatever group you're part of, you will be shaken badly, you know. But if you're taught, no, you're following a living God by the grace that's provided through Jesus' blood and his Spirit living in you, it still is like, whoa, that's different. But you don't have to have a crisis of faith, because you're still trusting this God. You didn't assume you'd ever fully understand a God that is infinite and eternal and all knowing, these kind of things. And I think this is why the disciples were able to absorb these messages, because they were taught the same things that everybody else was taught, but they were able to absorb it because they had more of that learning mentality instead of that it's already been decided mentality. And I'm not suggesting they're more spiritual, because there's all kind of evidence that we've covered that they're not. But kudos to them. Now, to be honest, I honestly think that most in this crowd were like, we don't know what just happened. Like, there's a lot of words there, and we've just covered 4 verses of teaching so far, and we're still like, we could talk about this forever. So I think it was more of the feeling they had from him. I don't know how many individual words they picked up on. And they may not have even picked up on this because he's just getting started. They're just getting warmed up listening. But when you unpack what it means, if a person's really taking this in, it's either confrontive and life-giving, or confrontive and I'm not saying life-taking, because it's all life-giving, but confrontive and I gotta seek my own safety. And that's where I think a lot of Christians get really angry and dogmatic. They feel the threat, look where the world's going, and instead of saying, hey, God can do something amazing here, they think we got to protect ourselves.
That's good.
And you back up and get ugly, because I feel it in my own spirit.
Yeah, that's good. So what amazes you now?
Well, that's it. No,
Okay.
What you said was so there. We've really unpacked it. Is that whole dynamic, and then you put it so well, is you've got this continuum of people that still exist, and many probably couldn't hear it if we apply the parable of the sower to this, where there's some that's on the road and some that's got the rocky ground. Mm-hmm. And, I think that was happening. But to the hearer, I guess that's really what you said helps bring it out to me, how amazing this was to the person that was like, man, I love God so much, and I see all this injustice, not simply by the Romans, but by our own religious leaders. But what else do I got? I'm stuck. And something in this isn't right, because I really want to love God, and how life-giving. I mean, for the person that was able to just take in the first 5-10 words, that could change their whole life.
Oh, yeah.
If they just believe if they believe this is the guy, this is the Messiah.
For sure. I mean, I can't imagine the sort of, because I've grown up my entire life as an American, and I've been told, I was told, you can be president, you control, you can vote, you are the democracy, you are like you get to take an active vote. But for somebody who is at the absolute lowest, who can't defy Rome, who can't defy the religious leaders, who are beholden, probably don't even own their own land, who are beholden to whoever they're working for, or whoever basically owns their work, to hear the first words out of this guy's mouth that says, like, hey, like, you feel downtrodden, you feel worthless, you feel not good enough. Not even that, you're also you're materially poor. You're absolutely right. Hey, like, what I have to say, what the kingdom of God is about, like, you, like, this is for you. And I just love that idea of somebody who like went along with the crowd. It's, oh, my buddy's going, or this guy's a disciple, and so I'll kind of follow him around. I knew him when he was a kid, and just like skeptical, because I mean, I'm a very skeptical listener when I hear sermons, or when I just hear people give talks, and just for somebody to have never been told in their entire life that basically this is saying, like, hey, you're a son and daughter, for the first time, that for somebody ever really be told that you belong, you matter, and not just like you belong and you matter, but like you are the essence, like what you're experiencing, the things that draw it out. Right. This is the essence of what it is to belong in this thing that I am bringing about.
That is beautiful. That's beautiful. Yeah, that's a whole new imprint on my mind, thinking about that contingency in the audience, which they're humans, so there's a percentage at least, that are hearing that. Can I jump into what perplexes me?
Go for it.
One of the most fascinating things when you're talking to a crowd of people, and that can be a dozen or 1,000, is trying to frame how do you get into that message and how you said it. And a big part of it is trying to assess, to whatever degree you can, who am I working with here? And like, for example, I've spoken at things where there are hundreds of people, but there was enough. I had earned their right to. I'd earned the right to speak because they knew me, and they, this kind of thing, and they'd been around, and so it was much freer. But one time I spoke to a locker room of football players. They invited me in, and I mean, if there is a place this man Jason Thornton does not belong, I am the poster child for. I tried at one point to live healthy, and I'm in the slow process of giving up entirely, and so I'm standing there. And I am trying so hard to relate to them. And it's like the more I talk, the more they are physically disconnecting from me. Like they're just sitting around in the locker room at their places. It's pregame.
Oh,
they
gosh.
get crushed. They get crushed in the game. That's so if there's any correlation, that's how bad it was. But I wanted to leave. I knew they wanted to leave. The coaches were like, "Why the heck?" And the kid that invited me to speak, I felt so bad for him. And I thought, I don't know what I would have done other than saying, guys, you live in a world I don't live in. I really respect the fact you've done this over and over again. I'm just going to pray that for the best for you. That would probably been the best for me.
Oh, God. Secondhand cringes.
Yeah. If I really hated you, I'd invite you to go with me, and I'll just pick some random locker room to walk into. But my whole point
invited this guy?
Yeah, I know. I've never liked you, Connor, and here's the proof. But in verse 1 and 2, it's a fascinating dynamic. Like, why even tell us this? But Jesus sees the crowds. He goes up on a mountainside and sits down. And then you say, and taught. But then his disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. It's just a weird framing. So in my mind, he noticed there's a crowd. And notice he didn't bring the crowd together. So we don't know, are they wanting to be healed? We don't know. We don't know their motivation. We just know there's a crowd. He sees it, meaning there was a point where he didn't notice it. Mm-hmm. He sees it. He walks him to a mountainside. I'm like, how big is this mountain, number one? I think we think more of hillside, because how big can this crowd be if they're, lugging across this mountain?
I remember, I don't think it's that large. I think they know, right? They know the mountain, don't they?
I don't know. I know they think they do. But either way, you would know if there's any kind of crowd size, it can't be this super steep, not 4-hour climb or something. You get this sense He just goes to the side of this mountain and he starts teaching. But his focus there is on the disciples, and the way I see those pronouns, the them is the disciples. So then that creates this really interesting deal where I have actually had opportunity to teach. It was weird. I didn't create it, but like there would be teens there, and I'm teaching these teens, I don't know, 20, 30 teens, but then there'd be a collection of other people, or I've been on mission trips where I'm speaking in a public place, and there's a mission team, which is 20, 30, and then a collection of 70 or other people just milling about. You know what I mean? It's just this weird dynamic, but we know from the end, the larger crowd was amazed. So it's just, why even put this? Why not just put he taught that? What's the significance if I believe there are no throwaway verses here? And I know somebody can say, well, you're just making too much about it. But if his focus is on the disciples, it has a different feel. If the crowd is kind of like, if the crowd left or the crowd stayed, he doesn't really care because he's there teaching his disciples, or else he wouldn't have pointed it out. And I don't know what that... Does that give me the right? I guess here's where it is, because it comes down to decision-making for how this shows up. Does this give me the right in general to say, okay, 300 people showed up in my church, but I'm really only going to focus on 12 of them? Or we don't even know. He hadn't chosen disciples. There may be 3 there or 10 there or whatever. Or there may be 70. I don't know. But it is, I don't know, it's an interesting distinction. I would think you would preach to the crowd first and to the ones closer to God second in terms of who you're making your emphasis to. Because who you think your audience is affects how you're teaching. So I don't know. It's weird that he even sets it up this way, and then I don't know the implications of it.
What I wonder, so Jesus gives this message, and then the disciples remember it for years later, and they go on to teach it, and they go on to tell people, hey, this is what our Savior said. And when the disciples go out, they then have, none of them are like living rich lives, but they are at the center of this movement. They are at the center of this, at this movement. And to have the authority that the people who are the new religious elites, the people who are now the ones disseminating the information, the people who are now in charge of the flow of religious information, are direct witnesses to Jesus saying that the lowest of the low is where it's at. And then the disciples still going on to continue to teach that, which is another just incredible thing. In reversal, you'll maybe that's why he says it to the disciples, because the disciples will soon be put in a position where they could be in the opposite of this, have the opposite spirit, have the opposite approach of what Jesus is talking here. So maybe that's it. I don't know. I don't know if you caught any of what I was saying.
Yeah,
there.
No, that's good. It made it jump into my head and we've discussed this before, where the parable of the sower is a great example, because that's one of the times where he tells the parable, and the I don't know what the disciples do and don't understand, but they specifically pull him aside and like, what are we talking about here? And then he takes the opportunity, what's that, Matthew 13, where he's like, yeah, I tell these stories so they don't understand. And you're like, that's really ineffective communication on like any measure. But it actually, that's a direct statement of what may be happening here in a lesser way. Now he does use some parabolic, if you will, words throughout the Sermon on the Mount, but it's largely direct, do this, don't do that. It's really actually very unique teaching for Jesus, who usually teaches in parables. And when it comes to, even with individuals that ask direct questions, he rarely answers those direct questions in a way that would satisfy. It's almost like he's saying, you're not asking the right question, over and over again to people and then redirecting them. So it is an interesting, the Sermon on the Mount is really unique in that way compared to all the other teaching he does. But I do think you're right. There is this intentionality of Jesus. And I don't know. I don't know how that affects my teaching of people when I know. I really like to think, hey, if there's 300 people here, all 300 of those people are way tuned in. Now, as soon as I say that out loud, I'm like, no, they're not. There's 30% that are like, where are we eating lunch again? Did we eat there yesterday? That kind of thing. There's a percentage of people that heard something I said 2 minutes in, and they're doing their own sermon in their mind, which I think is fantastic, Yeah. I just know after preaching so long and seeking feedback, nobody is tracking what I'm really saying. That unless I just have one point, and I usually do only have one main point, but usually it's some sub point, something else, and that's fine. I don't think we should have tests and then grade whether you listened well enough. But Jesus' hyper-awareness of this, where he's really teaching to the disciples, understanding that the crowd's going to take it in, maybe even anticipating they're going to be amazed because he taught different than their teachers.
So this is really kind of opening up a new thought to me of if you were meeting with somebody who you knew was going to be like the next, let's say it's a young woman who's like 16 years old, and you knew she's gonna be the next Billy Graham, or you're meeting with a guy the next day, and you knew he was gonna lead, he's gonna be the next Craig Rochelle, gonna lead a life church, and the sort of temptations that come with that, the sort of things that lead that just are really treacherous about that. And if you were like, man, what is one of the things I really want to communicate? That like these attitudes, these Beatitudes, the posture of which Jesus calls his disciples to directly, is exactly what you'd want to communicate to the next, leader of a revival or a leader of a mega church, because we wonder so often, how do these big leaders keep failing, and how do they keep giving way to all these unhealthy attitudes? It's just so against the stance and the posture of what it is to be a follower of Jesus and to live out the gospel. And I think it's because it's the disorder of the attitude, the disorder of the posture and the attitudes that people have to how they view themselves in light of God. And so for Jesus, the first thing he wants to say to his disciples when he's sitting down to do this big, massive teaching, does he have in his mind, hey, some of these people are going to become the most famous people in all of history, and some people are going to experience them with the biggest high they could, like, imagine the savior of the world like coming back to life, and the sort of emotions and hormones and feelings that you would have coursing through your body, and saying like, they are going to have, like, Satan came after me with the world, and what is Satan going to come after with these people? And so how can I prepare them? How can I help them not follow it? Because these people, like the disciples, they were poor, they were, a lot of them, meek, they were all these things, and the thing that was coming for them so easily could take them away from these things, could take them away and far, if they don't have them yet, could take them even farther away from what Jesus is calling them to. And so I wonder, I think it's very possible all these things are in the mind of Jesus when he's thinking about this and preparing for it and teaching it. But the teaching itself is groundbreaking. And then, just like we're talking about here, the intricacies for how and when and who he's communicating to it, and why and how how he thinks it's going to pay off. It's just so mind blowing.
It is. And that was so eye-opening to me when I was taught, and then I've kind of come to believe it more and more, that everything is intentional that God does. You can't have him being all-knowing and all-loving and all-powerful and then be like, he wasn't even paying attention to that. I know every hair on your head, my eyes on the sparrow. I pay attention to the minutest of minutia. And then, so you can't look at these words, understanding there were so many more words that could be included, and say, well, that has no bearing. It means something, but we may not know what. So what about for you? What perplexes you?
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is always a thing that just struck me as really difficult with this first half of the Beatitudes. I feel like everything I was taught, and everything I see out in the not everything, most things that I see out in the world in terms of what it is to be a follower of Jesus, nobody sets these up as their mission statement or their goal. Nobody's like, in the year 2022, I'm going to be more meek, or for Lent this year, I'm just going to be really focusing on being poor in spirit. Like we talked about just a second ago, the language that Jesus uses is so intentional, and so important, and there's so many nuances in it, and to think. There are people. I know there have been people. I've seen people, say that sort of thing in 22. I want to be meek, but just how every way we set up our lives is so contrary to these things. Later on in the Beatitudes, of be peacemaker. Okay, yeah, I'm going to try to set myself to be peacemaker. That's really great. But when it says, "Do I hunger and thirst for righteousness?" Okay, abstractly I can say yes, but do I hunger and thirst? Do I hunger and thirst to be lesser, to be poor, so that God would be more? Do I hunger and thirst to be meek, so that to not be powerful, to not have my will be the one that wins out in the end? And just it's perplexing to me, because it's obviously such a massive deal to Jesus, and we have things, we hear, not my will but yours, Father, be done, and that's incredible. That's the big deal. That's a massive deal. But it's really telling to me that we don't get T-shirts made of these. Nobody wraps up a sermon really and say, hey, this week go and be meek, or this week, recognize and be poor in spirit. This week don't try to enforce your will on the. So I mean, and again, this sounds very critical outwards. It's much more critical inwards. That when I think about how do I grow closer to God, or how I become a better person or a better father, or a better husband, it's not these things. And so it's perplexing. It's perplexing my own right, because I see the beauty. I see it so, and when I can see these things in myself, it is so. These sort of things are the way, the reality of the upside down kingdom of God is. It's one of the most beautiful things that attracts me to Jesus, that the truth of this rings so pure in my heart, and yet the truth so often, like I'm not putting myself, I'm not posturing myself to chase after these things like I want to chase after other successes. And so that's the perplexing thing for me.
I think you saying that really, I don't like it. I don't like you saying that. It's like I realize these things are, I can't think of a good term, but it's like a firewall. Like when my faith all falls away, I'm like, hey, I was only supposed to be poor in spirit. Like after I bomb, or I feel like everybody's against me, or whatever it is, it's ultimately the devil attacking me and having some success in that attack. I go, hey, no, it's good that I feel hungry and thirsty. It's good that I'm mourning, But you're right. These are not what I aspire to do. I'm not a control guy, but I do aspire to work in my world. I was about to say manipulate, but it's usually not, it's not evil intention, but it's like, okay, God has given me these resources, these gifts. I need to, figure out a way to make this work. I know that if we're all learners, we could just get together as a community of faith, a small group, whatever, and say, hey, here's a problem. Let's walk through it. Here's this verse. What do we, we're not living up to, I've got situations all the time where I'll be with groups of people that aren't living up to what they've committed to, sometimes very specific agreements, like I will be leading this group. Basically, if you give anybody wiggle room, they wiggle right out of their commitment, So then it leaves me like, so should I be really hard and controlling? Hey, you got to show up and because sometimes that's the only way I respond is somebody else has to say, look, this is who it is. And, which is not my personality, but sometimes it's more loving to the person. And my point in all this is it tends to ebb and flow, but you are definitively right. To me, the cost is usually too high for me to emphasize I'm poor in spirit, because then I feel like that makes me way too vulnerable. And yes, God will save me in general, but that doesn't mean he's going to protect me in this conversation in the way I would want to be protected, or this relationship. God has really been amazing to me this last week. Man, Connor, I cannot overstate. It's probably 5 or 6 different relationships that I have felt very betrayed by, very hurt by, and then all of a sudden they're back in my life. And I've got these choices to make of what am I going to do with this, and I'm pretty proud of the decisions I've made to recognize, hey, this is of God, and embrace it. I don't know how I'm showing up in them. Like, even after it's done, I'm like, is that what you wanted, God? Because I listened and I tried to love the best I could. It certainly didn't feel satisfying. It didn't feel necessarily reciprocal. Like, hey, I'm doing all the work here, and you said hurtful things, and I feel like we should start with, hey, you said hurtful things. Do you still feel that way? Do you owe me an apology? Is there something I need to apologize for? But instead, it's like, let's try to pretend like nothing happened and start again. And then I'm like, is that deceptive? Is that not my yes being yes and my no being no? And so, but at the end of the day, I'm like, okay, I still did it. I could have just avoided it, and I did it. You know what I mean? So that to me starts to tap into that poor in spirit and that willing to suffer. There's that sense here. But I didn't create those situations. I could have called him a month ago or 2 months ago. God just, it's like he's putting all this on me. Boom. You know what I mean? Hey, here's all these people that you feel like have hurt you, whether that's real or not. And now I want you to love them. And it's like, oh, and they're not my enemies. They feel that way sometimes, Mm-hmm. So it's easier if it was not easier. How do I say this? If I knew they were like complete atheists and actively are against me all the time, mm-hmm. It's a little bit cleaner because I'm not expecting reunion there when I love them. You know what I mean?
Sure.
So part of that's probably why it feels a little bit stale, false, hollow, is that, man, I tried to love well and it didn't have the fruit that I thought. So that makes me feel even more vulnerable.
Yeah.
Am I screwing it up again? Kind of feel. Mm-hmm. So it's very convicting.
I think about it on the personal scale of when I, whether it's somebody I've been in strife with or I go, you really covered it really well on the personal level. But I think on the corporate level or on the larger scale, are we people that when we claim the mantle of being a follower of Jesus, when we claim the mantle of being a citizen of the kingdom of God, would then proudly wear it? And here's what that means about me. And the first thing that my Savior says about that is that I'm poor in spirit. And I just think, sadly, for so many people and for so many churches, we can claim we claim the mantle of God. We claim the citizenship. We claim the sonhood or the daughterhood, and yet we are not claiming our rightful inheritance alongside of that. And the rightful inheritance of a son or daughter are these things. And our work is seeing the beauty in that, is seeing the beauty in being these lesser things. And that that's a life's work. I'm not saying that's an afternoon's work. But we have these affirmations that we hear all the time, of all these true things that God says about us, and they're absolutely true. And the King of the universe, one of the first things he says about his people are these things. And so maybe that's my encouragement for myself this week is I'm more than a conqueror in Christ. I'm all these things. I'm a son. And I also need to claim my inheritance of being poor in spirit.
Okay. So that is inspiring to me. So I have inherited the freedom, because I'm connecting that blessed are, that's that, absolute peace, and you have what you need. I have inherited the freedom to be poor in spirit. I have inherited the freedom to mourn and to hunger and thirst and to be meek and not to be scared, not to feel overly exposed, and to have confidence that he's going to work through. And I do think, and this is just why people periodically will ask the question, why doesn't God work like he worked in the Old and New Testament and all these miracles, things like that? And one of my answers is, well, God is God, but there's all kinds of situations in the Bible where he didn't do things miraculous, like hundreds of years that stretch on, where he could have just gone in and bang, bang, here's a miracle, and everybody's paying attention now, but he didn't. So he acts in accordance to what is needed in the situation. And I live all buffered. I don't need him to heal me. I've got doctors. I don't need him to provide my food. I got a job. I don't need him to. You see what I'm saying? Whereas people in less affluent situations, and I'm not glamorizing poor people. Poor people can be as faithless as affluent people, but you think about it less.
Yeah.
I know when I've had times of need, when I was living off support, and a church would say, hey, we can't support you anymore, and now where do I come up with that money all of a sudden? I was much more prayerful. There's a lot of people that are intimately connected with Ukraine or with Russia, and there's great lament right now about that. Man, they will look back on this time, however this gets settled, and they'll think, man, I was much more connected with God during that time. So there's a living example of when we are forced to mourn and we trust God's got us, our relationship builds. And so it's up to me to free myself to mourn right now. Even if and Ukraine does touch me, but you see what I'm saying.
Absolutely. Man, I love that episode. And so you can join us next week as we discuss the back half of the Beatitudes. Thank you for listening. Grace, peace, and love.